you find yourself in the echoing, drafty hall of a stone chateau in 12th century Provence. Outside, lavender fields stretch to the foothills, and the gentle hum of bees floats in the air. Inside, however, an altogether different buzz occupies the minds of nobles, troubadours, and quiet onlookers. It is not warfare, famine, or plague. It is something far more complex, or rather, something the court called finamore, refined love, courtly love, the art of loving the unattainable. But what did that mean in practice? Let's begin not with the lovers, but with the architects of this peculiar tradition, the troubadours. These wandering poet-musicians were often minor nobles themselves. Fluent in the Occitan language, they roamed from court to court, offering their lyrical services in exchange for lodging, favors, and recognition. Contrary to modern assumptions, they were not simply serenading maidens from balconies. Their compositions were meticulously constructed, full of coded metaphors, stylized longing, and rigid formal structures. One such form was the canso, a poem of admiration and yearning. The lady, often of higher social rank and already married, was placed on an idealized pedestal. The poet was the devoted servant, suffering nobly for his love. This love, crucially, was never consummated at least not publicly. That was the point. It was love, sharpened by denial, purified by its impossibility. The pain itself was the virtue. The influence of Eleanor of Aquitaine looms large here. She ruled over one of the most powerful duchies in France, and later became Queen of both France and England. It was under her patronage, and that of her daughter, Marie de Champagne, that the ideas of courtly love took institutional root. Court was more than just a seat of power. It became a school of love. Courtly love, though poetic in tone, had its own system of rules, not unlike chess or theology. Andreas Capellanus, The Art of Courtly Love, reads almost like a manual. Some of its chapters include what qualities a man should demand in his mistress, how love may be retained, the rejection of love. His rules include such pronouncements as, marriage is no excuse for not loving. Jealousy increases the feeling of love. A true lover does not desire to embrace anyone except his beloved. In other words, courtly love coexisted awkwardly with marriage, which was seen more as a social contract than an affair of the heart. The church dictated marital obligations, but courtly love emerged as an aristocratic rebellion, a coded space for emotional intensity in a world of arranged unions. This dual system produced fascinating contradictions. A man might be a faithful knight to his lord, a dutiful husband, and yet a lover in anguish, reciting verses to his unattainable lady while pledging chastity as proof of his devotion. But did real people believe this? Or was it a literary game? There is no simple answer. For some, it was a sophisticated metaphor, a way of expressing loyalty, artistry, and inner virtue. For others, particularly those outside the aristocratic sphere, it may have seemed like a preposterous luxury. Yet the influence was undeniable. Even the structure of romantic letters shifted under its weight. Writers emulated troubadour styles, infusing their correspondence with longing and elaborate praise. Women, too, participated. Contrary to the assumption that they were merely passive muses, several Troubadourets female troubadours composed poetry that inverted the dynamic. They wrote of male lovers, of betrayal, of agency. Women like Beatrice de Dea left behind verses that show deep insight into power, rejection, and dignity. I must sing of that which I would not, so bitter do I feel about him. Their voices challenge the overly simplified view that courtly love was just male projection. In some cases, it became a dialogue, albeit one restricted to elite circles. As we peer into the historical record, we also find legal documents and monastic complaints that suggest courtly love had real-world consequences. Nobles accused of adultery or caught writing improper verses were sometimes tried or fined. Some monasteries explicitly banned certain troubadour styles, calling them disturbers of the soul. Yet, despite ecclesiastical resistance, the tradition flourished. Rituals performed in whispers, letters, glances, and songs. There's a curious irony to it all. In a world filled with actual suffering crusades, famines, epidemics, this fantasy of elegant heartbreak became a cherished pastime. For the privileged, perhaps it was a means of distraction. Perhaps it was its own kind of spiritual discipline. You wonder, was courtly love a genuine emotion, or was it just the performance of one? Imagine you're a noble attending a feast in the court of Marie de Champagne in the early 13th century. You're surrounded by velvet drapery, slow harp melodies, and the sharp smell of roast game. But beyond the material grandeur is something more elusive, a set of unspoken expectations. Here, everyone knows their part in the silent theater of courtly love. The glances across the hall, the slight bow to a lady as she passes, the folded note slipped silently under a chalice. Guided by expectations as intricate as a stained glass window. This is not love as possession or even affection. It is love as aesthetic, almost liturgical in tone. It was, in many ways, an invented tradition, fabricated, cultivated, and maintained by the nobility. But courtly love wasn't just entertainment or escapism. It reinforced social order, even as it pretended to challenge it. To understand the oddity of courtly love, we must remember who it served. Marriage among nobility was never about love, was about land, titles, alliances, emotions, had no place in treaties. Courtly love, however, allowed people, especially those without inheritance or military rank, to gain prestige through emotional sophistication. A younger knight, with little wealth, could rise in influence not by conquest, but by composing the most brilliant verses for a lady of the court. His rivals might compete not with swords, but with poems and gestures. This was especially true in the courts of love-real institutions, though semi-theatrical in function, where ladies acted as judges and settled disputes on matters of love. Did a man love too soon? Was his gesture sincere or manipulative? Could love survive betrayal? In one case, recorded by Andreas Capellanus, a woman accused a suitor of abandoning her after she refused him physical affection. The court ruled in her favor, declaring that true love must endure disappointment without retaliation. Another ruling addressed whether a peasant could love a noblewoman. The answer, diplomatically phrased, was essentially no. Courtly love was the realm of the elite. It needed fine clothing, poetic skill, leisure, and time to suffer beautifully. The poor could love, but not in the courtly sense. Their love was considered base, practical, and devoid of refinement. This reveals a deeper truth. Courtly love wasn't just about affection, it was about identity. It allowed the aristocracy to distinguish itself from both peasants and clerics. If the church emphasized spiritual purity and the peasantry focused on survival, the nobility claimed the space of noble suffering and elite, aestheticized anguish, while courtly love operated as its own moral and social system. It could never fully ignore the church, and the church, for its part, was deeply skeptical. Clergy often viewed courtly love as dangerous, a gateway to adultery, distraction, and moral decay. It seemed to offer a competing vision of virtue, one rooted in passion rather than obedience. In sermons and letters, bishops warned against the temptation of songs and poetry. One particularly fiery critique came from Peter Damian, who denounced not only the content of love songs, but their rhythm and melody, claiming they seduced the soul away from God. Music, when directed toward the body and not the divine, was considered a spiritual threat, and yet, ironically, some of the same rhetorical flourishes used in courtly love began appearing in mystical Christian writings. Saints wrote of divine longing, spiritual agony, and ecstatic union in language that mirrored the troubadors. This merging of emotional vocabularies led to strange overlaps. Could a poet's longing for a noble lady resemble a monk's yearning for Christ? Could the same tool's metaphor, devotion, sufferings, serve both eros and agape? This blurring of sacred and profane would haunt European literature for centuries to come. For the lady at the center of a courtly love drama, the position was complex. On the one hand, she wielded power selecting lovers, judging competitions, influencing reputations. In a world where women had few legal rights, this emotional authority was one of the only forms of sanctioned agency. On the other hand, she remained confined by both gender roles and social expectations. Courtly love celebrated the lady's beauty and virtue, but often demanded her silence. Her approval was sought, but rarely her voice, unless she chose to write. Female troubadours, or troubadours, continued to challenge the structure. Their verses were sometimes fiery, sometimes melancholic, but always clear. They were more than muses. They were critics, participants, and authors of their own emotions. Consider the work of Azalea de Porcaragues, who wrote, "He who can sing should not be silent, for joy must be spoken, or else it dies." Others, like Castellosa, lamented love's burdens, how it asked everything and gave little in return. Her poems were not about fantasy. They were documents of psychological reality. And yet, few women could publish such works. Most noble women's involvement in courtly love remained performance in feasts, dances, and whispered poems written by others on their behalf. This paradox deepened the tension of courtly love. It celebrated female power, but only within tightly controlled parameters. Courtly love did not stay in southern France. It spread first to northern France, then to Germany, England, Italy, and Spain. In each place, it morphed. In Germany, the Minnesänger adopted the tradition, often more somber in tone. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer would later parody courtly love in the Canterbury Tales, showing its absurdities, even as he honored its beauty. In Italy, Dante Alighieri and Petrarch elevated the ideal into a more philosophical, even mystical realm. Dante's Beatrice became less a woman and more a divine concept. Petrarch's Laura was a symbol of unreachable beauty. always glimpsed but never held. This shows how courtly love originally, a poetic game in feudal courts, evolved into a foundational lens through which Europe interpreted passion, longing, and even spiritual experience. But beneath the evolving forms remained the same kernel: desire without fulfillment, love as a path to refinement, and suffering as a kind of virtue. Today, the remnants of courtly love are everywhere, if you know where to look. In Valentine's Day cards with florid metaphors, in love songs about heartbreak, in novels where love is chaste, restrained, and filled with miscommunication. Even the idea of a crush, a one-sided, often unrequited obsession, has roots in the structure of courtly love. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is emotional: the belief that love is more meaningful when it hurts, that suffering is somehow proof of sincerity. Whether that belief is beautiful or dangerous is up to interpretation. As we step out of the candlelit chamber and into the sun-warmed gardens, a question lingers in the perfumed air. Did courtly love liberate emotion from duty, or only chain it to a different kind of performance? By the late 13th century, the golden age of courtly love had begun to fade. The troubadours, who once lit up castle halls with songs of longing and devotion, were now increasingly marginalized, replaced by newer forms of entertainment, or silenced by shifting political winds. The world that had made their craft possible was changing, and with it, so too was the nature of love. But courtly love didn't vanish. Instead, it transformed, and in some ways, it became more potent, echoing across the centuries in subtler, less musical forms. Let us walk one last time through the rose gardens of medieval affection and see what grew after the bloom. The decline of the troubadour tradition in southern France was tied closely to war and politics. The Albigensian Crusade, 1209–1229, launched by the Catholic Church against the Cathars of Occitania, devastated the very regions where courtly love had blossomed. With the crusade came northern French influence, papal authority, and a crackdown on heterodoxy, not just of religion, but of culture. The courts that had nurtured love poetry were either destroyed or absorbed. Many troubadours fled, fell silent, or shifted their craft to more acceptable themes. The remaining practitioners faced a world less interested in verse and more invested in law, commerce, and orthodoxy. Some troubadours tried to adapt, turning their attention to moralistic poetry, political satire, or religious verse. But the sharp edge of love poetry dulled under scrutiny, where once it had skirted the boundaries of the sacred and profane. Now it was deemed suspicious, even subversive. In time, even the courts of love, those half-serious assemblies presided over by noble women, disappeared or transformed into literary salons, eventually giving rise to Renaissance academies centuries later. The rules of love remained, but the culture around them had changed. Though troubadour poetry waned, its form and structure left deep impressions. The strict stanzaic rules, the use of senile, a code name for the beloved, the art of the tenzo, a poetic debate, and the emphasis on internal virtue over external possession, all of these would be passed down. These would influence poets like Dante, who turned love into theology, Petrarch, who turned love into memory, and even Shakespeare, who turned love into comedy, tragedy, and irony. In many ways, The structure of courtly love became a scaffold for Western romantic storytelling, the tension between desire and restraint, the elevation of the beloved into a symbol, the tragedy of missed opportunities, the romantic triangle, the unreachable muse, the noble lover, torn between duty and passion. These are not just tropes, they are the bones of our stories. One of the most fascinating legacies of courtly love is what happened to the figure of the lady in troubadour poetry. She had been silent, idealized, remote. In later literature, she became a prism, sometimes an angel, sometimes a devil, but always symbolic. Dante's Beatrice, for instance, is barely a real woman. She is a guide to paradise, a spiritual compass. Petrarch's Laura is likewise unapproachable, forever out of reach. Her beauty frozen in verse. But not all writers maintained the illusion. Some saw through it. By the late Middle Ages, female voices began re-entering the conversation, not as idealized muses, but as complex speakers. In Christine de Pizan's book of the City of Ladies, the author reclaims intellectual and emotional authority for women, pushing back against centuries of poetic objectification. Even in satire, we find signs of rebellion. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the 14th century, created female characters who mocked or manipulated the rules of courtly love, showing how absurd or hypocritical they could be in practice. Through humor, protest, and reinterpretation, women gradually shifted from objects of longing to subjects of experience. It's easy to treat courtly love as a historical curiosity, but the line between literary convention and social reality was never clear. Did knights actually pine for unattainable women? Probably. Did noble women encourage them? Sometimes. Were there affairs? Certainly, but not always. Courtly love blurred the boundary between performance and sincerity, much as social media blurs identity today. People played roles but often believed in them. The rituals, exchanging poems, wearing tokens, performing gestures, gave emotional texture to lives that were otherwise scripted by feudal obligation and religious doctrine. They allowed people to experiment with identity, with emotion, and with meaning. And even when those rituals were no longer fashionable, the emotional grammar remained. In modern times, courtly love seems archaic, quaint even, but its ghost lingers in romantic comedies, pop lyrics, teen crushes, and even online dating. Consider how many relationships are still shaped by the pursuit of someone out of your league. The idea that love should be painful, to be real, the romanticization of longing over fulfillment, the assumption that rejection heightens value. These are not biological instincts. They are cultural scripts, learned behaviors passed down, reshaped over centuries. Even in the modern world, love is still often seen as a quest, not a collaboration. That idea, romantic though it seems, has costs: emotional miscommunication, power imbalances, and unrealistic expectations. We inherited the myth, but perhaps forgot to question it. Courtly love was, by any standard, strange. It celebrated unfulfilled desire. It created elaborate rituals around inaction. It upheld social hierarchies, even as it claimed to transcend them. And yet people loved it, perhaps because, in a violent and hierarchical world, courtly love offered a space, however performative, for emotional freedom. It was a structured chaos, a game with rules, but also stakes, a rehearsal for vulnerability. a coded cry for meaning. In a world ruled by law and bloodline, in the end, the question isn't whether courtly love was sincere or false, revolutionary or regressive. The question is, what does it say about us that we still crave the ache of unfulfilled affection? You awaken before sunrise, the air in your cell still cold from the night's frost. There is no fire, no candle, no mattress, just a wooden platform, your blanket, and a rising sense of responsibility. It's the 1260s. You are a monastic scribe, one of the unsung engines of medieval knowledge. Your world is not war or courtly entreat, it is the labor of language. The silent transcription of sacred and legal texts that will outlive you by centuries. Welcome to the scriptorium, the beating heart of a medieval monastery's intellectual life. It is at once a sacred space, a workplace, and a place of quiet suffering. Imagine a long, vaulted chamber lined with narrow desks. The only light comes from slitted windows, offering meager natural light. On overcast days, you work in near darkness. Your tools are limited: sharpened quills, iron gall ink, and rough parchment tanimal skin that smells faintly of lime and flesh. The noise is minimal: the creak of stools, the slow breath of fellow monks, the occasional cough. No conversation. Your task is simple in principle, grueling in practice. Copy text, line by line, letter by letter. A single mistake, and the whole sheet may be ruined. Worse, it's scripture. It must be corrected with the utmost care and humility. Each manuscript takes months, sometimes years, to complete. A large Bible might take 4 to 5 years for a single scribe. And you're not just copying words, you're copying meaning, ensuring the theological integrity of each line. The process begins with ruling the parchment using lead point, or a blunt stylus, to draw lines for margins and lines of text. The text must be justified, each line perfectly aligned on both sides, no indentation, no mess. Then comes the scripta handwriting style, which in your region may be textualis or Caroline minuscule, depending on the influence of the local ecclesiastical schools. Letter forms are standardized. Every A must be shaped like every other. A. You pause to dip your quill in ink. You blot carefully. You never smudge. You are not just writing. You are preserving civilization. The typical day of a monastic scribe is dictated not by workload, but by the monastic schedule, the divine office. The day is segmented into canonical hours, each marked by prayer, not productivity. Here's a rough outline of your day: matins, pre-dawn, wake and chant, psalms, lauds, morning praises, at sunrise. Prime, brief reading, and the beginning of labor. Terce, mid-morning prayer, sext, noon prayer, and a simple meal, bread, pottage, none, mid-afternoon prayer, followed by more work, vespers, evening prayer, compline, final prayer, before sleep. You squeeze your transcription work between these liturgical intervals. Progress is slow, fatigue is constant, and yet the rhythm gives your work a kind of spiritual cadence. You are not merely copying texts, you are meditating on them. Mistakes do happen. Some scribes, frustrated, leave marginal notes. Oh my hand, double quotes. The ink is bad today. Thank God, it will soon be dark. These small human cries, still visible in extant manuscripts, remind us behind every perfect page was a tired monk despite the monotony. The tools you use are remarkably sophisticated. Each element of the scribe's toolkit is carefully crafted for the job. Quill pens, usually made from goose or swan feathers. The feather is hardened, cut at an angle, and slit to form a nib. You resharpen it constantly. Ink, made from gallnuts, oak tree growths, iron salts, and water. The result is acidic and can damage parchment over centuries, but it dries rich and dark. Parchment, treated skins of sheep, calves, or goats. The best is vellum calfskin, smooth and pale. Knives, not for protection, but for scraping away errors. A sharp blade removes ink and parchment fibers to erase mistakes. When you finish a page, it may be sent to another Muncan illuminator to add decorative initials, borders, or illustrations. These embellishments often include gold leaf, blue azurite, or vermilion made from cinnabar. You might not see the final result for months or at all. Your job is invisible labor. The illuminator gets credit. You get discipline and a sore back. You do not choose what to write. The abbot or library master assigns texts based on need. Most common: Scripture, Latin, Vulgate, Bible, commentaries, Psalters, theology, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory the Great, canon law, ecclesiastical regulations, liturgical texts for use in mass and daily offices, classical texts, Cicero, Aristotle, though often censored or modified, legal documents, charters, land grants, tax records, vary occasionally. You'll transcribe something less sacred: medical texts, almanacs, or astrological treatises, but always under watchful eyes. The priority is preservation, not originality. Creativity is discouraged. Your goal is fidelity, not flair. Still, many scribes find small ways to leave their mark: a decorated letter here, a personal note there, or even a playful doodler face in the margins. A rabbit chasing a knight, a monk on stilts. These illustrations, though rare, are not merely whimsical. They are mental survival tactics in a world of repetition. Scribes were often trained as oblate children, given to the monastery by their parents. From an early age, they were taught Latin grammar, calligraphy, and silence. Their minds were trained to empty, to focus fully on the text. It was not considered creative work, but it was spiritual. Some called it manual lectio divina, divine reading through the body. There were even superstitions about copying sacred texts. Some believed every letter written earned you grace in the afterlife. Others saw errors as spiritual failings. By the time a monk had copied an entire Bible, often multiple volumes, depending on the monastery, he would have read the text hundreds of times, word by word, sentence by sentence. He knew its rhythms like his own breath, but at what cost? The constant sitting, the poor lighting, and the stress of perfection took a toll. Monastic medical treatises note symptoms like scribes, palsy, ink sickness, and eye strain. Some monks developed hand tremors, others ulcers from prolonged fasting. Their reward: silence, obedience, and perhaps salvation. As your candle burns low and your eyes begin to blur, you stare down at your page and wonder, are you merely a copy machine in a robe, following orders in ink? Or are you part of a fragile chain, stretching from ancient Alexandria to the present day, a link in the preservation of civilization? You will never see your readers. You will never know if your work is admired. But you write anyway, because if you do not, who will? The monastery isn't the only place where ink flows like lifeblood by the mid-13th century. Beyond the abbey walls and cloistered scriptoriums, a new breed of scribe is rising. The lay clerk, the royal notary, the parliamentary record keeper. These are men, rarely women, who work not for God, but for kings, barons, merchants, and judges. They do not chant psalms. They calculate taxes, draft wills, and record property disputes. And they are everywhere. In London, the ink-stained heart of Plantagenet bureaucracy beats steadily. The city's narrow streets are filled with sound, hawkers, hooves, hammers. But in the tall, cramped offices around Westminster, there is only the scratch of quills and the shuffling of parchment. Welcome to the Chancery England's Royal Writing Office. Here, scribes draft writs, letters, patent, and court orders. Unlike the monks, these men are often paid professionals. Some are former clerics. Others are educated commoners with a gift for Latin and patience for routine. They're expected to write in a steady Anglicana or court hand, the two dominant scripts of the day-sloped fluid, designed for speed. Their tools are more refined than in the monasteries: smoother parchment, darker inks, specialized forms of address. Each letter must begin with formal salutations and end with legal flourishes, given under our hand and seal. This 3rd day of March, in the year of our Lord, these scribes are bureaucrats, but essential ones. They create the paperwork that holds the kingdom together. Without them, land deeds vanish, taxes go uncollected, and no one knows who owns what. The lay scribe works to a different kind of rhythm, one driven not by prayer but by urgency. The exchequer must be balanced by the end of the quarter. The Court of Common Pleas expects 6 copies of a property settlement. By next Monday, the sheriff's writs need to go out before sundown. This is not meditative work. This is deadlined labor. Scribes are often hired in teams, paid by the line or by the document. They work long hours under pressure, knowing that mistakes can result in property disputes, missed inheritances, or even executions. They rely on clerks of record, junior copyists, and rubricators who add red headings. In large offices, a master scribe dictates aloud, while others write in unisuna, medieval form of data replication. Errors happen. Margins become crammed. Ink runs. Scribes improvise. They develop shorthand notations, marginal flags, and even secret marks to denote stages of document review. Despite all of this, the tone remains detached, formulaic, almost lifeless. But beneath the legalese is a chaotic human world. Lovers, disinherited, villagers fined for grazing their pigs improperly, merchants suing over spoiled wine. You begin to realize the scribes aren't just writing. They are documenting the social nervous system of the realm. While official records rarely mention women as scribes, we know they existed. Some women, especially nuns, widows, and educated city dwellers, worked informally as copyists. Others acted as assistants to male scribes, managing office tasks or preparing parchment. A few, like Marjorie of Westminster, are documented as writing land charters or debt acknowledgments, often in familial or guild settings. Women's literacy rates were lower than men's, especially in Latin, but not negligible. Among merchant classes, It was practical wives managed inventories, read contracts, and maintained household accounts. Their names are often lost, but their hands are visible in flourished capitals, subtle stylistic quirks, and in the steady, unacknowledged copying of texts they would never claim as their own. By the late 13th century, England is becoming increasingly bureaucratic. The reach of written law expands. Property disputes multiply. Town charters, trade regulations, and legal codes grow more complex. This creates enormous demand for literate intermediaries. Enter the itinerant scribe, freelance copyist who travels between towns, writing for those who cannot. He writes wills for the dying, contracts for apprentices, petitions to lords, and letters of complaint. He may carry seals, blank charters, and samples of script to prove his legitimacy. His rates vary by region, document type, and urgency. He is both essential and mistrusted illiterate man among the illiterate, whose words can define fates. He walks a thin line between scribe and sorcerer, especially in rural areas where writing is still viewed with suspicion. Sometimes people believe that ink itself has power. With literacy comes control, not just over documents, but over interpretation. Scribes decide where the comma falls, what is abbreviated and what is written in full, how a name is spelled door, whether it is recorded at all. They are the invisible editors of history. They shape the record that future generations will treat as fact. Some become powerful by proximity. 2 lords, secretaries, 2 bishops, clerks, 2 judges. They know what others don't. They speak Latin when others mutter dialects. They write clean, unambiguous lines in a world of oral contradiction. And with every letter, they accrue intangible authority. Yet the work remains tedious. Their backs ache, their vision dims, their hands cramped. Do not. Writing lasts as you walk through the corridors of Westminster. Scrolls under your arm and deadlines looming, you wonder who truly holds the power. The baron who gives the order, the priest who gives the blessing, or the scribe who writes it all down and decides how the story is told. You are older now. Your hands ache before you even pick up your quill. The ink stains on your fingers no longer fade completely. Your eyes strain, your back stiffens, and your hearing has dulled from decades spent bent over vellum in silence. But still, each morning, you return to your writing bench, because your work, the silent labor of copying, drafting, and preserving, has become your identity. And now, for the first time, you begin to think about what will remain after you when a king dies. It is the scribe who records the date when a treaty is signed. It is the scribe who captures the terms when a man gives his land to a son or a woman leaves a dowry to her daughters. The only proof that such actions ever occurred lies in ink and parchment. Oral memory fades. People forget. But parchment especially, the durable vellum used for charters and sacred text scan, last centuries. And so, the scribe becomes not just a worker, but a curator of permanence. Consider this: if an injustice is committed but never written down, does it exist in history? If a hero is forgotten by the scribes, is he truly a hero? You realize now that your profession has never been neutral. The words you choose, the punctuation you apply, the names you record or omittal of it, shapes how future generations will understand the past. You are not merely preserving truth. You are defining it by the end of the 13th century. The world of scribes is splitting into two increasingly distinct realms. The monastic scribe remains cloistered, copying scripture and commentary, working slowly in candlelit silence. His work is sacred, but his influence dwindling. The lay scribe, meanwhile, is stepping into the secular spotlight. In cities like London, York, and Norwich, scribes serve courts, guilds, and royal offices. Their work is faster, more functional, and increasingly in demand. The rise of common law, town charters, and merchant accounting means that writing is no longer an art form reserved for the divine. It's a tool of governance, and with it comes a new kind of respect, not always formal, but practical. A good scribe is trusted like a locksmith or a surgeon. This is the beginning of a long transition. Within a few generations, writing will no longer be seen as exclusively sacred. It will be professionalized, commodified. The scribe becomes a civil servant and, eventually, an administrator. Technological shifts also shape the scribe's world. One of the most important is the shift from scrolls to codices, that is, from long-rolled manuscripts to books bound with pages. This change, already underway by the 12th century, is now standard. Two odds are easier to reference, more compact, more durable, more suited to mass copying. By medieval standards, this makes them ideal for legal texts, theological compilations, and record-keeping. Large institutions like the Church and the Crown begin creating centralized libraries of bound volumes, most produced by teams of scribes. Some volumes, such as Doomsday Book, contain more than just records. They represent entire visions of the realm, its people, its land, its wealth. You may never write such a book, but you understand the implication. Writing is no longer just memory. It is administration. It is control. And it is becoming indispensable as the century turns. Another change stirs the scriptoriums, the rise of vernacular language. Until now, nearly all official documents have been in Latin. It is the language of church, law, and learning. But now, scribes begin to see requests for English, French, and even Middle English dialects. This is revolutionary. Latin was the gatekeeper. Only the educated could read it. But with vernacular writing, more people can participate in written culture, even if just a little. This doesn't threaten the scribe's profession yet. Instead, it expands it. New scribes must now know multiple languages. Marginal glosses, notes are added in English or French to help readers navigate Latin texts. Eventually, full legal records, romances, and medical texts will appear in English. By the 14th century, the tide will turn. The people will want to read their own stories in their own tongues. For now, you write as you always have, but the murmurs are growing louder. The monopoly of Latin is weakening, and with it, the barriers between the writer and the world. You don't know it yet, but just 2 centuries from now, your entire way of life will vanish. With the arrival of the printing press in the mid-15th century, human copying will no longer be necessary for mass dissemination. A single printing workshop will do what once took an entire monastery 5 years. Your craft will become a relic. Some will mourn its passing. Others will welcome the efficiency. The age of manuscripts will become the age of books. But even then, your legacy will remain. For centuries, printing houses will model their typefaces on the handwriting of scribes. illuminators will continue decorating printed books. The idea of authorships, so rare in your world, will flourish because of the foundational work you did, word by word. So perhaps you will not be forgotten after all. You will never be known by name. Your manuscripts may be preserved in university libraries, but no one will know the curve of your letters, the choices you made, or the hours you spent correcting a single stroke. And yet you are everywhere. You are in the laws we follow. You are in the records we consult. You are in the stories we read, and the margins we overlook. History may forget the scribe, but history cannot exist without the scribe. And so, as your hands tremble one final time, and you sign your last folio with a modest scriba humilis Dei, the humble scribe of God, you leave behind not your name, but your labor, a quiet legacy of written breath, still echoing centuries later. The Roman Empire did not fall in a day. It fell in ledgers. While poets later imagined Rome collapsing in fire, sacked by barbarians, and haunted by ghosts, the real decline of the empire, especially in the West, was far less dramatic. It came not with swords, but with rescripts, grain, requisitions, tax assessments, and decrees written in increasingly Baroque Latin by men sitting behind desks. This is the story of paperwork at the edge of collapse. And in many ways, it is more tragic and more relatable than any battlefield. Our story begins in the late 3rd century, with a tired empire barely holding itself together. The crisis of the 3rd century had nearly shattered Rome. Civil wars, invasions, economic implosions, and rapid-fire emperors had left the empire fractured and ungovernable. Enter Diocletian r. 284 to 305, a soldier emperor who sought to fix not only the military, but the very structure of empire. And how did he do it? Not with more conquests, but with paperwork. Diocletian understood that Rome had become too large, too complex, and too unruly to be managed by charisma alone. So he introduced the tetrarchia rule of 4 emperors, each managing a quadrant of the empire. But behind that political fix was an even deeper change, the bureaucratization of nearly everything. The empire became a grid of provinces, with new levels of regional administration. He massively expanded the imperial bureaucracy, creating a pyramid of clerks, notaries, and tax agents. The state now demanded detailed records of land, labor, and resources. Every town had to report population counts, livestock holdings, and harvest yields. These figures were used to calculate tax in kind. Grains, oil, cloth, and even oxen were demanded as tribute, and with these reports came paperwork, endless, repetitive paperwork. The state no longer governed just by decree. It governed by form. Within this new imperial framework, a new class of professionals rose to prominence, the notarii. They were the imperial scribes, once minor assistants, now wielding enormous influence. They handled imperial correspondence, provincial reports, legal petitions, military supply, inventories, appointments, and dismissals. Their work was tedious, formulaic, and unseen but indispensable. They became the lubricant in the machinery of empire. By the 4th century, the most important imperial officials weren't necessarily generals or senators. They were bureaucrats, like the Praetorian prefect or the magister of Fusirum, the masters of documents, records, and regulation. This created a curious inversion. The pen grew more powerful than the sword, even as the empire's borders became less defensible. At its height, the imperial civil service employed tens of thousands. Cities like Antioch, Milan, and Trier housed enormous administrative offices. In Constantinople, the new Rome, the bureaucracy became a city within a city, where one's rank could be determined not by family name but by position in the notitia dignitatum, the official register of imperial posts. The world was now governed by grades, titles, and seals. The expanded bureaucracy brought order but also weight, especially in the realm of taxation. Diocletian's reforms created an incredibly detailed and rigid tax apparatus. The empire was divided into taxation zones, each required to produce specific quantities of grain, labor, and goods. A system called the annona allowed the state to requisition supplies directly from producers. Military garrisons were fed not by markets, but by tax grain transported via imperial routes. Landowners were required to submit detailed records. Failure to comply meant seizure, fines, or worse, and yet the system was deeply flawed. Local officials often overestimated yields to protect themselves, leaving poor villagers crushed by impossible demands. Peasants fled their land, entire regions depopulated. The state responded by binding people to their professions, a system that would later evolve into medieval serfdom. The tax rolls grew even as the tax base shrank. It was a feedback loop of collapse. More bureaucracy created more burden, which created more evasion, which created more enforcement, which required more bureaucracy. By the 4th century, even elite landowners found the system unbearable. Some begged to resign from senatorial rank because wealth now meant liability. Managing an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt required reliable information flow. To achieve this, the empire developed one of the most sophisticated communication systems in the ancient world, the cursus publicus. This was the state-run courier system, an elaborate network of post stations, supply depots, and draft animals available only to those with official permits called diplomas. Messages from one end of the empire could reach the other in a matter of weeks, thanks to riders who changed horses at intervals and traveled by night when necessary. And what did they carry? Rescripts from the emperor's census, data tax, demands, military orders, administrative queries, but the system, like everything else, was expensive. Maintaining the cursus publicus required a whole parallel system of logistics. Riders were bribed. Some stations simply vanished as the economy weakened. The empire had built a communications marveland, could barely afford to keep it running. Despite its complexity, the imperial government tried to appear accessible. Citizens could write petitions libelli to the emperor or his representatives, asking for justice, exemption, or mercy. These petitions were handled by specialized offices like the Sacra, Scrinia, divided into departments, memorials, epistles, and rescripts. But in practice, the petition system was overwhelmed. Thousands of letters arrived each month. Most never received a reply. Others were routed through layers of officials, edited, delayed, or simply discarded. Still, the hope remained that the emperor might read your plea and intervene in many ways. The empire had become a machine of hope, slow, rusting, and unresponsive, but still seen as the last authority. By the end of Diocletian's reign and into that of Constantine the Great, the Roman state had become an empire of documents, departments, and deadlines. It survived through systems, not sentiment. But as you trace the long shadow of this paperwork empire, you begin to wonder, was Rome's decline the result of external threats? Or did it drown in its own files, unable to adapt, simplify, or let go of its obsession with order? When your leaders speak only in decrees, and your economy runs on fear, does the ink become heavier than the sword? By the mid-4th century, the Roman Empire was still standing, but just barely. It had 2 capitals, 2 emperors, and dozens of ministries, but fewer soldiers than before, fewer taxpayers, and fewer illusions. The western provinces were already crumbling, while the east grew rigid and anxious, like a structure slowly hardening before it cracks. And at the center of it all sat an immense, unwieldy bureaucracy, still filing, still copying, laws for past populations, rituals no one remembered the purpose of cons, and officials with more titles than authority than machines still worked. But no one knew why it was still running or for whom. When Constantine the Great came to power in 306 CE, he not only legitimized Christianity, but deeply reshaped the imperial administration. He established Constantinople as a second capital, strategically located and defensible, and made the eastern provinces the nerve center of imperial paperwork. He restructured and multiplied administrative posts, creating high offices for imperial secretaries, master of supplies, master of soldiers, and countless subordinate clerks. What had once been a network of local governors and military leaders now became a labyrinth of titles and chains of review. One such document, the Notitia Dignitatum, compiled in the early 5th century, lists hundreds of bureaucratic posts, military units, provinces, and jurisdictions. It reads like an imperial phone book, ornate, over-detailed, and alarmingly disconnected from reality. By now, almost every professional role in the empire, ferryman, baker, even gravedigger, was part of a collegium, a state-controlled guild. These were hereditary and tightly regulated. Sons followed fathers. Prices were fixed. Movement between professions was discouraged. This was not a free market. It was controlled survival, and scribes managed it all. Holding a government post in the late empire was often a curse, disguised as prestige. For example, a curialist, a city official in charge of tax collection and maintenance, might have once been proud to serve. But by the 4th century, the job was financial ruin. Why? Because tax assessments were increasingly inaccurate, and the official was personally responsible for making up any shortfall. If farmers fled, and they did, or crops failed, as they often did, you had to pay their share. Many officials fled their posts or faked their own deaths to escape obligation. Others bribed imperial agents to be transferred or simply went into hiding. The imperial response: laws banning the declining of honors. You were no longer allowed to refuse a promotion. If you were named a decurion, you were expected to serve, pay, and suffer. Even titles like comes companion to the emperor, count, or tribune carried expectations of cost: hosting events, maintaining staff, sponsoring civic projects. Glory was expensive. This irony would become a pattern. The more the empire decayed, the more it relied on compelled service, and the more it punished those who complied. Roman justice had once been admired for its efficiency, but by the late 4th century, imperial courts had become infamously slow, corrupt, and inaccessible. Petitions submitted to imperial courts could take months or years to be processed. Local officials could be bribed to lose or delay them. Rich citizens often hired advocati fisci lawyers, specialized in navigating imperial tax disputes, to manipulate outcomes in their favor. Asterisk documents had to be sealed, signed, dated, and often copied multiple times to satisfy competing authorities. Appeals required payment, travel, and political favors. This spawned a darkly comic phenomenon, the permanent lawsuit, a case so tied up in process that it outlived its litigants. The bureaucracy, once designed to bring order, had become a source of legal entropy in this collapsing legal and administrative world. They interpreted decrees for local officials. They decided which petitions advanced and which were shelved. Some became wealthy, others merely feared. The Magister Memoria, master of petitions, for instance, was one of the most powerful men in the court, advising the emperor directly, shaping how laws were applied. There were also secretary imperial secretaries, with specific domains, rescripts, letters, and complaints. Many laws from this period preserved in the Theodosian Code weren't written by emperors, but ghost-written by scribes, edited to suit shifting policies and obscure agendas. This professional class lived in a strange paradox. They had no armies, no lands, no temples, but they could decide fates. By 390 CE. The bureaucracy had reached a critical mass. There were now thousands of officials tasked with monitoring, reporting, calculating, and responding to crises that never ended. Inflation surged. Germanic tribes pressed the borders. The military was stretched, implemented, and returned with results, by which point the demographics may have changed. In Gaul, army logistics became so mismanaged that commanders took control of tax collection themselves, bypassing the bureaucracy entirely. In Rome, public offices kept running, but often by inertia. Clerks went to work, scribes filed papers, but increasingly the emperor no longer read them. It was a world in which bureaucracy continued out of habit, not effectiveness. There is something tragic about a state that outlasts its usefulness. The Roman Empire still had emperors, laws, and seals, but fewer and fewer people believed in their meaning. And so we ask, was the late empire still ruling, or was it just recording its own decline in triplicate? It is now the end of the 4th century. The Roman Empire has split permanently into East and West, each with its own court, its own bureaucracy, and its own crumbling illusions. In Constantinople, clerks still process edicts in candlelit offices. In Ravenna, the western capital, officials draft tax lists and land grants with ink-stained fingers. On the surface, the machine is still humming, but the truth is harder to ignore. Now, there are more officials than soldiers. The empire is full of forms, but empty of power. The structure remains, but the substance has withered. And somewhere in this late twilight, a file is written, stamped, and shelved, marking the requisition of grain for a garrison that no longer exists. The paper empire has outlived the real one. After the death of Emperor Theodosius I in 395, the Roman world was never whole again. His two sons inherited separate halves. In the east, Constantinople, Honorius, in the west Milan. Then Ravenna. The split might have seemed practical, even elegant to courts, to chains of command. But it only deepened the crisis. The West was overwhelmed by threats. Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, Huns, yet its administrative apparatus remained fixated on procedure. Cities fell, but bureaucrats continued to assess land taxes in ghost towns. A document from this period, buried in the Codex Theodosianus, declares, "No man shall escape his duty, even should the city fall." It was not law, it was delusion. By 410 CE, Rome itself, once the heartbeat of civilization, was sacked by the Visigoths. Yet, in the chancelleries of Ravenna, paperwork did not stop. Laws continued to be issued. Edicts were posted. Petitions were filed. Some of the most haunting documents from this period are lists of titles, of court officials, of tax assignments describing systems that no longer functioned. The Notitia Dignitatum, compiled around this time, still lists dozens of frontier provinces and military units, most of which had been overrun or abandoned. It was an empire in denial, filing for control. Long after control had vanished, provincial governors reported to cities that had been razed. Scribes documented troop movements for armies that no longer answered to Rome. Grain doles were distributed according to rosters written decades earlier. It's as though the Roman state believed that writing something down made it true. With military collapse accelerating, local strongmen and barbarian leaders took control of towns and provinces, but they often retained the Roman titles. Why? Because legitimacy still came from paperwork. Even invading kings like the Ostrogothic Theodoric and the Frankish Clovis later sought recognition from the Eastern Emperor, not for protection, but for bureaucratic validation. They wanted their reigns legalized in the Roman tradition. They wanted the paperwork. Rome, even in death, was still the only institution that mattered. And so, in a darkly ironic twist, the Roman bureaucracy outlived the empire that created it. In 476 CE, the so-called fall of the Western Roman Empire occurred when Romulus Augustulus, a teenage emperor with little authority, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic general. But in Constantinople, no one recognized the fall. Paperwork continued. The imperial court still listed western provinces on maps. Edicts were sent westward. The Roman Empire, at least on parchment, remained intact. Even local administrators in Italy and Gaul continued using Roman forms and seals. The schools of imperial administration persisted. Young boys still learned how to draft official letters, even as Gothic soldiers drank wine in the streets outside. The empire had not fallen. It had simply forgotten how to notice it had died. Despite the loss of territory, power, and armies, the Roman bureaucratic tradition continued in the East. The Byzantine Empire, Rome's legal and administrative heir, lasted another 1,000 years. There, the scribes evolved. Forms were rewritten in Greek, titles were reshuffled, and imperial rituals grew even more elaborate. Yet the same mindset remained. That order was created through paperwork, that the written word held legal force, that to rule was to record even. When Byzantium eventually fell in 1453, many of its administrative models were adopted by Islamic caliphates, European kingdoms, and even the early Catholic Church. The scribe's hand continued to shape the world. The story of Rome's bureaucracy isn't just about inefficiency or decadence. It's about the tension between structure and reality, the danger of systems becoming so intricate, so procedural, that they can no longer respond to the world outside their walls. Consider laws that don't match circumstances, offices that exist only in name, taxes levied on abandoned farms, titles granted without authority, borders defined on maps, not in life. Sound familiar? The Roman Empire shows us what happens when a state's ability to document outpaces its ability to act. Was it when Rome lost its armies, or when it lost the will to govern? Or was it when the scribes stopped writing? Because they never did. Long after the emperors faded and the legions disbanded, the paperwork continued unchanged, unchallenged, unread. The last breath of Rome, perhaps, wasn't a cry of war, but the scratch of a stylus completing a requisition form that no one would ever fulfill. The mist hangs low over the rice fields. The sun has not yet burned through the morning fog. You are awake, standing barefoot in the cold mud, already working, already calculating not profits or ambitions, but what you will owe. You are a peasant farmer in feudal Japan, likely in the early Kamakura period. You live in a modest wooden house, thatched roof, earthen floors, and you till land that does not belong to you. You are neither poor nor free. You are part of the village system, governed by obligations as old as the mountains around you. And today, like every day, your thoughts turn to taxes, not coins, not checks, not digital filings. You pay in rice, in sheep, in cloth, bamboo, and sometimes your own labor. This is a story about the real machinery of survival in feudal Japan, not the samurai, not the court, but the quiet negotiation of obligation. Year after year, by the 12th century, the Heian aristocracy was fading from direct control. In its place rose a new ruling class, the samurai elite, backed by the Kamakura shogunate, a military government centered around the warrior code. But none of that changes your daily life. For you, the land is part of a shuen, a private estate, owned by a noble, a religious institution, or a retired official. These estates are tax-exempt at the national level, but not free of local obligations. You rent your plot through a multi-layered chain of authority. The land technically belongs to the court, noble in Kyoto. It is managed by a local steward, appointed by the shogunate. Taxes are collected by village heads, who answer to official scribes, who report to samurai administrators. In other words, the land you live on has layers of owners, none of whom work the soil. Each year, your household must meet its quota measured in weight, not currency. Rice measured in koku, roughly enough to feed a person for 1 year. Sheep rare, but valued for wool and manure. Cloth, especially hemp or raw silk, firewood, bamboo poles, paper, miso paste, dried fish, occasional corvée labor, helping build roads or fortifications. This is not a single payment. It is seasonal, fragmented, and negotiated. Your village head tracks it all in charcoal ink on scrolls, stored in clay pots, wrapped in oil paper to keep dry. Some families barter with neighbors if they can't meet their assigned portion. Others plead with the steward to reduce the demand in bad harvest years. None of this is democratic, but it is personal, intimate, relentlessly human. In a world without digital records, how is tax collected accurately? Very carefully. During harvest, official samurai agents or sometimes Buddhist temple stewards rive with weighing devices. These are not scales as we think of them, but balance rods and counterweights, calibrated and marked with stamps. They inspect your bundles of rice, dried and bundled in straw. They note moisture, content, quality, and volume. Disputes are common. If your yield is lower than expected, the tax may still stand. It's your job to make up the difference, sometimes through selling your labor, sometimes by borrowing from neighbors. A common rural saying is whispered: the tax is never hungry, it eats before the children. Scribes, traveling with the tax officials, copy your name into the village ledger. You don't read it, you don't sign, but you see your name marked beside a tally. It will be reviewed in Kyoto, and it will be binding. Currency is rare in your village. You've seen coins, Chinese imports, or copper rounds issued by the central government, but you do not use them daily. Instead, the tax system accepts alternate goods. Sheep are uncommon in Japan's wet climate, but where raised, they serve a unique role. Wool can be spun or offered to Buddhist temples for ritual cloth. Hemp cloth is valued both for use and trade. Some households specialize in spinning and weaving, paying tax entirely in fabric. Fishers pay in dried seafood or fermented paste. Craftsmen pay with goods, lacquer bowls, knives, bamboo baskets. This creates an economy of adaptation. You become a better weaver, not to earn profit, but to meet your quota. A good fisherman is valuable because he helps the entire village avoid punishment if the rice harvest fails, and punishment is real. Defaulting on tax can result in confiscation of tools or animals, temporary enslavement to repay debt beatings by low-ranking enforcers, removal from your land. That last one is rare but terrifying, because without land you are unmoored. There is no state safety net. There is only exile. So your life becomes a careful balancing act, growing just enough, saving just enough, avoiding attention, and praying for no drought. Not all tax goes to warlords or government stewards. In many regions, tax flows directly to Buddhist monasteries or Shinto shrines, which own land through imperial grants. These institutions operate like businesses, with their own scribes, warehouses, and enforcement systems. To them, your rice is not just food, it is ritual fuel, monastic salary, and prestige. Temple scribes are often better educated and less corrupt than military agents. They're also more thorough. You find yourself offering prayers to the Bodhisattva of mercy one day, and then handing over your wool to a bald scribe from the same temple the next. Your religion and taxation are interwoven. Some temples are lenient. Others impose spiritual penalties on those who fail to pay. Imagine if you don't meet your tax quota. You may be denied burial rites, or your family may be excluded from ceremonies. Fear becomes internalized. You tithe, not just to survive, but to belong. At the end of the harvest, your house is quieter. You've made your quota. You still have enough millet and miso to last the winter. Your tools are your own. Your sheep are still in the shed. Your child is still listed on the village scroll. You have survived another cycle, but you wonder, is this life a form of skill, or is it merely endurance? You farm, spin, fish, build, praying for advancement, but to avoid collapse. You are not a samurai. You will never be rich, but you understand how things work. You understand what you owe, and to whom. And in this understanding, perhaps, there is its own kind of wisdom. Your village is not just a collection of homes, it is a living, breathing, administrative unit, organized around duty, memory, and season. By the 14th century, as Japan weathers famines, feudal skirmishes, and the rise of competing shogunates, one institution remains remarkably stable: the village record system. It is in these records, written in brush and ink on hanging scrolls and wooden tablets, that your life is measured not by dreams, but by debts. At the center of every village stands the nanushi, or village headman. He is both leader and liaison, trusted by villagers and feared by the distant authorities. He knows who is sick. He knows who owns which patch of rice. He knows who owes what. He does not collect taxes directly. He organizes the community to do so. It is a communal act. Your tax is your neighbor's tax. Failure reflects on the group. And so, once a month or once per season, the nanushi convenes at the village shrine or public hearth, unfolding scrolls from lacquered boxes. Each scroll contains names of households' crop yields from past seasons, assigned quotas in rice, textiles, or livestock, recorded infractions, lateness, poor quality grain, incomplete deliveries. He recites these aloud, not as punishment, but as reminder. In this way, bureaucracy becomes oral performance, like a ritual. Your life is re-narrated in tally marks. If you disagree with an entry, you may appeal, but only with support from neighbors or witnesses. The nanushi is not just a manager, he is a historian, the living memory of the village. The village also employs a scribe, often a literate monk or temple affiliate, who records events in a script called kuzushiji, a flowing, semi-cursive Japanese that ordinary people cannot read. He writes not for the present, but for Kyoto. Copies are made and dispatched to regional tax offices and temple archives, where they are stored untouched for decades unless something goes wrong. If tax goes unpaid, the records are summoned. If land changes hands, the lineage must be traced. If a new ruler rises, the old scrolls are compared to new ones, like overlapping shadows. You live simply, but the paperwork built around your actions is increasingly complex. You are indexed. By the 14th century, Japan's rural economy is becoming more diversified. Coinage begins to circulate. Small copper mon, imported from China or minted locally, find their way into trade. You start to hear about market towns, places where artisans, farmers, and merchants meet on fixed days to barter and sell. Now, your taxes might include a monetary component, especially if you grow a cash crop like tea or mulberries. Toll payments, if you transport goods through roads maintained by local warlords. Administrative surcharges, fees paid to temple scribes for record keeping or dispute mediation. Service fees, if you're called upon to help build a bridge, drain a field, or serve in a militia. The system doesn't simplify, it accumulates. Each new ruler adds a layer. Each temple expands its holdings. Each village grows more interwoven with the surrounding hierarchy, and all of it is still tracked on parchment or wood. Your entire world is being written into place, word by word. Sometimes things go wrong. A border fence is moved. A field is claimed by two families. A sheep is lost. A child is disinherited. In these moments, the tax system becomes legal theater. Disputes are heard not by courts, but by communal councils, led by the non-nushi, and assisted by the temple scribe. Evidence is oral. His grandfather tilled that field. My sister was married to the last owner. The god of the shrine recognizes this land as ours. Sometimes written records are produced charters with broken seals, faded ink, notes on bark or bamboo. But writing is supporting evidence, not dominant. Memory, custom, and story still rule. There is no appeal to a higher court, only escalation to a regional steward or temple head, which costs time, rice, and reputation. So most people settle locally. The aim is not justice, but continuity. Better a bad compromise than a broken village. Your year revolves around 2 calendars. The first is natural, planting, weeding, harvesting, snowmelt, solstice. The second is bureaucratic, tax quotas, audits, census updates, scroll deliveries, inspections. The two do not always align. You might be harvesting barley while a tax inspector arrives asking for your early rice yield, or called to serve in a labor party during the rice planting season. This leads to a secondary economy, labor sharing, resource pooling, seasonal loans, quiet acts of communal strategy to align the needs of nature with the demands of paperwork. You are not educated in law, but you know timing is everything. A well-timed delivery or plea can spare a season's suffering. Tax is not paid silently. Each delivery of cloth, rice, fish, or wool is accompanied by ceremony. The goods are wrapped, marked with a family crest or seal, and presented at the village temple or gate, often with bows, chants, or written prayers. You kneel not just in submission, but in acknowledgement of order. The tax system is not just economic, it is cosmic. The harvest feeds the gods protect the village pays its dues. The scroll records all in this circle. Survival is not independence. It sits in an archive beside thousands of others. And that somehow connects you to power as you sit by the hearth, your children asleep, and the tax quota met for another season. You think you are poor. You have no vote. You own no land. You cannot read the scroll that records your life. And yet, the system needs you without your cloth. It frays. Without your fish, it hungers. Without your rice, it crumbles. But still, if you disappeared tomorrow, would anyone in Kyoto notice? You wonder, does participation make you powerful, or does it merely mask your disposability? The winds shift, the skies dry, the rivers shrink, and suddenly, rice will not grow. You are in the late Muromachi period, and Japan is changing politically, climatically, and economically. The Ashikaga shogunate is weakening. The country will soon fracture into a century of civil wars known as the Sengoku period. But your struggle is older, quieter, and far less heroic. Your tax is due, and your fields are dust. As central authority collapses, local daimyo military lords rise to fill the vacuum. Some are benevolent, others brutal, but nearly all continue the system of rural taxation. They need resources to fund militias, build fortresses, and compete. With rivals, this means that taxes become less predictable. Previously, your village paid fixed dues to temples or court nobles. Now, the daimyo's agents may raise the rice quota, mid-season impose military service as a form of taxation, take not just grain, but tools, animals, or even family members, demand loyalty oaths, backed by written agreements known as kishimen. If you cannot pay, your land can be confiscated and handed to a more productive tenantor, to a soldier, as a reward. Suddenly, your status as a stable producer is under threat. You are no longer just a taxpayer. You are a resource to be optimized. The 15th century saw periods of drought and crop failure across many parts of Japan. Entire villages struggled to meet their quotas, but the state weather temple or lord rarely reduced demand, so villagers turned to substitution. If rice was short, they offered millet, barley, or sorghum. If cloth was scarce, they offered wooden, tools, or fish oil. In extreme cases, they offered labor in exchange for forgiveness of arrears. This led to the practice of collective pledging. Entire villages would sign a shared document promising to cover a tax quota together. If one household failed, the others would make up the difference. It was solidarity. It was insurance. It was survival through unity. But it was also dangerous. If a few households fled into the forests, to mountain temples, or to neighboring provinces, the burden became crushing. And so the village became its own jailer, though often painted as passive. Japanese peasants were not without recourse. When burdens grew unbearable, they organized rural leagues or uprisings, sometimes armed, sometimes political. These movements were localized, short-lived, almost always triggered by tax increases or famine. A notable example is the Kakitsu Uprising of 1441, where peasants in the Kyoto region demanded the abolition of debts recorded in temple and merchant ledgers. They marched into the capital, destroyed debt documents, and forced temporary relief. In some cases, entire villages refused to pay tax. They would send no harvest, no cloth, no man, only a sealed document declaring their resistance. Sometimes the daimyo punished them harshly. Other times he conceded, knowing that pushing too hard could depopulate his lands. These moments were rare, but they revealed a deeper truth. The village had leverage, not through wealth, not through politics, but through cohesion, even amid war. The scribes did not stop writing. Samurai commanders issued land surveys, kenshi, to reevaluate who owed what. These surveys were precise. They measured fields in tan, recorded irrigation sources, and even listed the crops best suited to each plot. This data was used to reassign land, reallocate labor, just taxation based on new rulers. You may have paid your dues for 10 years, but if your new daimyo favors another clan, your records could be overwritten and your land given away. You begin to understand the true battle is not on the field, but in the archive. By the end of the 16th century, as Toyotomi Hideyoshi reunifies Japan, a new system is put into place. The National Land Survey, the separation of warrior and peasant classes, a standardized system of koku taxation, formal village registration. From this point onward, your status becomes fixed. You are no longer simply a villager. You are part of a national tax grid. There is stability in this, but also loss. The flexibility, the bartering, the substitution, the appeals begin to vanish. Now, everything is recorded in official, unchangeable ledgers. The temple scribes still write. The daimyo's agents still visit. But now, the documents feel colder, less negotiable. Your world has become a spreadsheet written in ink. You have lived a full life. Your body is tired. Your children are now heads of households. They bring the harvest to the collection house. They carry the scrolls. And yet, You think back to a time when you could pay in sheep, when the tax collector still listened, when your neighbors could speak for you. Now, the forms arrive by courier. They are written in Kanban Chinese-style characters. No one in the village reads them anymore. They are translated by outsiders, obeyed without question. So you ask yourself, was the tax system a tool of continuity or slow erosion? Did it bind the village together or choke it into silence? Did your life matter, all that's left of? It is a ledger entry and a weight of grain. You don't know. You only know this. Tomorrow, your grandson will go to the fields, and the quota will still be there. Imagine you're walking through a village in early 17th century Bavaria. The air is thick with the scent of manure and wood smoke. Crows perch on half-timbered roofs. Fields stretch beyond the thatched cottages, but the crop growing beneath the soil is not wheat, rye, or barley. It is something strange, something foreign, something that villagers still call by whispered names, the devil's root, or the Peruvian weed. You are looking at a potato field, and in this moment of history that is deeply controversial. This is the story of the potato, a tuber so boring, so earthy, so ordinary, that it nearly changed the course of Europe's fate. But its journey begins not with kings or generals, but with suspicion, misunderstanding, and a long delay in acceptance. The potato was first cultivated over 8,000 years ago in the highlands of modern-day Peru and Bolivia. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, the indigenous peoples of the Andes had already developed dozens of varieties, each adapted to different elevations and soils. To them, the potato was more than food. It was woven into their cosmology, medicine, and even timekeeping. They invented storage methods like charqui and tuna freeze-dried potato products that could last for years. When the Spanish encountered these strange underground edibles, they were skeptical but practical. They brought potatoes back to Europe not because they loved the taste, but because they survived the voyage. The potato first arrived in Spain and Italy around 1570. From there, it slowly spread mostly through botanical gardens, royal collections, and scientific curiosity. But it didn't take root in the dinner bowl. European peasants and nobles alike were suspicious of the potato. It grew underground, and things from the earth, especially ones that didn't bear seeds, were often associated with poison or sorcery. It was not mentioned in the Bible, making it theologically suspect. It caused flatulence, a trait often linked to the devil in 17th century folklore. It resembled plants in the nightshade families, some of which are toxic, like Belladonna. In Germany, some called it Teufelskartoffel, the devil's potato. In parts of France, rumors spread that eating potatoes would cause leprosy or sterility. So, for more than a century, the potato remained a curiosity, planted in monastery gardens or palace plots, grown more for show than sustenance. To understand why the potato's journey was so slow, we must first understand what people were eating instead. In early modern Europe, the diet of peasants was mostly cereal-based: wheat, rye, oats, and barley supplemented by vegetables, turnips, cabbage, onions, occasional pulses, beans, and peas. Very little meat, unless they were close to hunting grounds or had pig's butt. These grains were highly vulnerable to bad weather, war, and soil depletion. A single failed harvest could mean famine, and yet they resisted change. Tradition held fast. Seeds were familiar. The oven was built for bread, and landowners controlled grain markets and taxes tied to wheat production. The potato was too different, too new, too low, too ugly, and yet it kept growing in time. A few enlightened thinkers and desperate rulers began to reconsider the tuber in Ireland. Potatoes took hold in the 17th century, not from royal mandate, but from necessity. The poor discovered they could yield high calories from small plots of land in Germany. Frederick the Great of Prussia, later in the 18th century, would champion the potato by tricking peasants into planting its surrounding royal fields with guards, making the crop appear valuable. In France, Antoine Augustin Parmentier, a prisoner of war who survived on potatoes, would later convince the French public of their value through lavish public feasts, including potato bread, soup, and even potato-based perfume. But during the early stages, from the 1500s to around 1700, the potato remained on the fringe of acceptability. It was eaten by prisoners, farm animals, monks, colonial subjects. Its reputation as poor food made it useful for the desperate, but socially toxic for the ambitious. Despite these social stigmas, the potato had a secret strength. It thrived where other crops failed. It could grow in high altitudes, wet climates, and rocky soil. It produced more food per acre than any grain. It could be left in the ground for months, effectively hidden from raiders or tax collectors. It required less labor than grain and less milling infrastructure in war-torn regions. The potato quietly saved lives. During the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, when much of Central Europe was ravaged by mercenaries and famine, communities that grew potatoes often fared better. But no official notice was taken. The victories were too small, too quiet, too unrecorded. The potato had no lobby, no church sponsor, no aristocratic champion, only roots and resilience. As the century turns and new wars loom, the potato remains in the margins, feeding the forgotten. Thriving in hidden fields, it is food, but not yet recognized as such. And so we wonder. In the end, the potato didn't fail. It was never meant to carry the burden alone. We asked too much of it and ignored the warning signs. The story of the potato is not just about food. It's about fragility in plain sight. What happens when the thing you trust most because it's always been there suddenly vanishes? It doesn't come with thunder. It doesn't make history books exciting, but it changes everything. And so you're left wondering, is real resilience found in growth or in the willingness to question what we've grown too dependent on? The desert wind stirs soft dust across sun-baked bricks. You stand atop a low, flat mound, overlooking a city that no longer breathes but once did, silently, with rhythm and order. You are in Mohenjo-Daro, one of the principal cities of the Indus Valley civilization, a Bronze Age society, known less for its kings or warriors, and more for its plumbing. Because while other ancient cities were building monuments to gods or glory, Mohenjo-Daro was doing something quieter, designing for cleanliness. It was a city built around drainage, sewage, and water control, a place where the true power did not come from palaces, which flourished from roughly 2600 to 1900 BCE, covered a region stretching across modern-day Pakistan and northwestern India. Its major cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and others, were carefully planned, built with standardized bricks aligned on a grid constructed with attention to flow of air, water, and waste. And yet, there are no known kings, no massive temples, and no dramatic inscriptions. We don't know the names of its rulers. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't even know why they vanished. But what they left behind was a city built on silent systems. Mohenjo-Daro's architecture was functional above all else. The city's defining features weren't military fortifications or massive statues. They were covered drains running along every major street, private toilets in many homes, public wells at regular intervals, bathing platforms complete with water channels, a sophisticated sewerage system connected to soak pits or cesspools. In essence, every neighborhood had a waste management strategy. Rainwater was channeled, graywater was guided away. Human waste was deposited in designated brick-lined containers, often emptied manually or filtered through sand. This wasn't luxury. It was infrastructure, and it was standard. It suggests a society that saw hygiene not as a privilege, but as a collective necessity. One of the most iconic structures in Mohenjo-Daro is the so-called Great Batha, massive, sunken brick tank measuring roughly 12 by 7 meters, with watertight bitumen lining and a system of drains and inlet channels. Scholars still debate its purpose. Was it religious, ceremonial, social, a public hygiene facility? Regardless of intent, its very presence signals something remarkable. The Indus people dedicated enormous resources to building a place where bodies were meant to be cleansed together, with privacy and process. Nearby, houses are built with staircases leading to upper-floor latrines, clay water jars stored in cool niches, individual drains leading to larger channels. In some neighborhoods, it's clear that wastewater flowed down into community drainage, while clean water was collected above ground. It is, in essence, a passive plumbing network. No pumps, no pressure valves, just clever use of gravity, sloped and porous materials, and all of it built more than 4,000 years ago. Despite all this engineering, one of the most puzzling things about Mohenjo-Daro is what it lacks. No central palace, no royal tombs, no grand processional roads, no war memorials, no evidence of an organized army in other civilizations. We find names carved into stone, records of conquest, declarations of divinity. In the Indus, we find beads, seals, measuring rods, and drains. This absence speaks volumes. The emphasis was not on hierarchy, but coordination, on civic life, not spectacle. The most important infrastructure was not seen, but used. They built not to impress the gods, but to live without disease. And that tells us something profound about how this civilization defined success. The bricks of Mohenjo-Daro were not arbitrary. They followed a standard ratio, 1 to 2 to 4, width to breadth to length. They were fired in kilns, ensuring durability. The clay was often mixed with straw or crushed sand, helping with absorptions. The drainage channels were sealed with lime plaster or bitumen, and in many cases, they sloped gently downward to promote flow. Larger homes included small settling tanks to collect solid waste before water entered the communal drains. This required not only engineering, but also ongoing maintenance, suggesting that some portion of the population worked as cleaners, drain inspectors, water porters. We don't know their names. They left no graffiti or manifestos, but without them, the city would have choked. Their work was the invisible bloodstream of an urban body. As you walk the quiet streets of Mohenjo-Daro today, rebuilt only in fragments, you see no palaces, no pyramids, no triumphal inscriptions, just bricks, walls, drains, wells, a city built to breathe, to flow, to last. And so you wonder, is a city great because of its kings, or because its people could live, bathe, and dispose of waste without getting sick? Mohenjo-Daro speaks softly through watermarks and erosion, through pottery shards and drain angles. But its message is clear. The future belongs to the quietly functional dot. The closer you look, the more it becomes clear. Mohenjo-Daro wasn't planned for glory, it was planned for living. In an era when most cities grew by layers of chaos, streets added wherever needed, buildings stacked on top of ruins, Mohenjo-Daro offers something radically different: intention, symmetry, drainage. It is the Bronze Age's quiet masterpiece, not of gold or war, but of grids and gradients, where sanitation was more than a necessity. It was the organizing principle of urban life. Archaeologists have long noted that Mohenjo-Daro was built on a grid layout, astonishing in its precision. Streets run north-south and east-west. They intersect at right angles. Each block contains multiple homes, many with access to shared side lanes or narrow alleys. Every street is lined with a brick-lined drain. This was not organic sprawl. This was designed. The city is divided into a citadel, a raised platform containing public buildings, baths, and large storage structures; a lower town, where residential neighborhoods were arrayed in tidy rectangles. But even the citadel lacks the usual hallmarks of ancient power. No throne rooms, no monumental sculpture, no barracks. Instead, you find granaries, wells, work, send closed, courtyards, send drains, always drains. Even the largest public structures have dedicated sewage runoff channels. The city was not built around temples. It was built around flow. What's most extraordinary is that individual homes had toilets. Yes, indoor, enclosed, purpose-built toilets, typically located in a small room at the back or side of the house. These latrines were built above, vertical shafts connected, 2 brick soak pits or ceramic catch basins emptied. The latrines were even segregated from kitchens and bathing areas, indicating an advanced understanding of cross-contamination. The most modest homes might lack a full toilet, but almost all had access to drainage and communal water sources. Imagine an entire Bronze Age city where human waste didn't flow into the streets, but into managed, hidden systems. You begin to understand how radical this was. What does it mean to design a city this way? It means sanitation wasn't just a solution, it was a mindset. We don't know the names of the Indus gods. We don't know their myths, but we know they built their cities around sanitation. That tells us something about their values. They prioritized public hygiene over public spectacle. They embraced uniformity over individual grandeur. They saw infrastructure not as background, but as Koran. Mohenjo-Daro, to be civilized, was not to build temples, but to manage water and waste with care. No other civilization of this era, not Egypt, not Mesopotamia, shows such widespread, consistent application of urban drainage. And this wasn't just at Mohenjo-Daro. Similar patterns are found at Harapalathal. Caitnanan was not a citywide quirk. It was a civilization-wide philosophy. But building a system is not the same as maintaining it. Drainage channels clog, soak pits overflow, clay pipes crack, charcoal filters degrade. So who fixed it? We don't know for certain. The Indus left no texts describing civic labor, but the architecture suggests routine upkeep. Access points were built into larger drains. Bricks were removable for inspections. Some homes show evidence of drain repair or replacement tits, likely that entire professions existed for cleaning drains, repairing wells, managing waste, transport. These people in name, undocumented, were the hidden class beneath a hidden system. Their job was to ensure nothing clogged, nothing flooded, nothing sickened. They were not honored in sculpture. They were not buried in stone tombs. But without them, the city would not have survived a single summer. By around 1900 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro and its sister cities began to decline. The reasons are still debated. Environmental shifts, a drying climate, shifting rivers, overuse of resources, earthquakes, disrupting the floodplain, or perhaps a slow unraveling of civic coordination. Whatever the cause, the evidence tells a story.